If you watch this video until the very end, you will never look at global power, technology, or national wealth the same way again. Not because of money, not because of armies, but because of something quieter, deeper, and far more decisive. The minerals that decide who builds the future and who is forced to buy it. Today, that future runs through rare earth elements, and hidden inside the Arctic ice, Greenland holds a quiet position that most people completely misunderstand. On paper, Greenland looks small, isolated, cold, distant from the centers of power. But beneath that ice, the numbers tell a different story. According to the data, Greenland holds approximately 1.5 million metric tons of rare earth reserves. That places it 8th in the world. Not first, not dominant, but not irrelevant either. It sits between the giants and the forgotten, large enough to matter, yet politically constrained enough to remain dormant. At the top of the world, China holds 44 million metric tons of rare earth reserves. Brazil follows with 21 million. India holds 6.9 million. Australia controls 5.7 million. Russia holds 3.8 million. Vietnam has 3.5 million. The United States holds 1.9 million. Then comes Greenland, at 1.5 million metric tons. In raw geological terms, Greenland is not poor. It is simply unused. This is where perception and reality begin to split. Most people assume that reserves equal power. They assume that if a country has rare earths underground, it can automatically convert them into influence, leverage, and wealth. But the second column in this chart tells a more uncomfortable story, because production, not reserves, is what shapes the present. And Greenland's production is not small, it is zero. Greenland has never had commercial rare earth production. Not 1 ton at scale. Not one operating mine feeding the global supply chain. Environmental regulations, local political resistance, and economic barriers have kept those reserves locked in place. So while Greenland appears on the reserves list, it completely disappears on the production list. It exists in theory, but not in flow. Now, look at China. China does not just lead in reserves, China dominates production. China produces approximately 270,000 metric tons of rare earths per year. The world total annual production is approximately 390,000 metric tons. China alone controls roughly 2/3 of that flow. That is not a market position. That is structural dominance. That is control over the bottleneck of modern technology. Rare earths are not actually rare in the geological sense. They are difficult to separate, expensive to refine, and politically sensitive to mine. They are essential for electric vehicles, wind turbines, missile guidance systems, smartphones, advanced radar, precision weapons, and artificial intelligence hardware. Without rare earths, the modern world does not scale. It stalls. This is why Greenland's position is so strategically strange. Greenland is rich enough to matter, but silent enough to be ignored. It holds 1.5 million metric tons in the ground, but contributes nothing to the present supply. That means Greenland is not shaping today's market. But it could shape tomorrow's leverage. This is where long-term power logic comes into play. In geopolitics, what matters is not only what you control now. What matters is what you could control if the rules changed. Greenland represents latent supply, dormant supply, strategic optionality. And in a world where China dominates production, any alternative supply source becomes automatically political. China's 44 million metric tons of reserves represent nearly half of the world's known total, which is listed as more than 90 million metric tons. That alone gives China long-term confidence. But China's true power comes from refining capacity, mining infrastructure, and regulatory willingness to absorb environmental costs. That is why China controls both reserves and flow. It is not just rich in minerals, It is willing to extract them at scale. Greenland, by contrast, is constrained by a different logic. Environmental protection, local opposition, and political sensitivity have created a high barrier to mining. That makes Greenland clean on paper, but irrelevant in practice. In the short term, this protects ecosystems. In the long term, it also protects China's dominance. From a cold strategic lens, Greenland is not a producer. It is a bargaining chip that has not yet been played. It is geological leverage without operational leverage. That makes it interesting to superpowers, investors, and defense planners, but invisible to consumer markets. The United States holds 1.9 million metric tons of reserves, slightly more than Greenland. But even the U.S. produces only 45,000 metric tons per year. That is less than 1/5 of China's production. This gap is not accidental. It is structural. It reflects decades of offshoring, regulatory complexity, and cost-driven dependency. This dependency creates a strategic asymmetry. The countries that dominate production can shape pricing, supply stability, and political pressure. The countries that only hold reserves remain vulnerable unless they activate those reserves. Greenland currently sits firmly in the second category. Here is the uncomfortable truth. In modern power systems, unused resources are almost as weak as non-existent resources. Potential does not move markets. Output does. Until Greenland converts reserves into production, it remains strategically quiet. But quiet does not mean irrelevant. Quiet means unactivated. And in geopolitical terms, unactivated assets attract attention, especially when supply chains are fragile, especially when global tensions rise, especially when nations begin to realize that technological sovereignty depends on mineral sovereignty. Look again at the ranking. Greenland sits above Tanzania, South Africa, and Canada in reserves. Yet those countries also show zero production in this chart. That tells you something important. This is not only about geology. It is about policy, economics, and political risk tolerance. The countries that dominate production are willing to tolerate environmental damage, political friction, and capital intensity. The countries that do not keep their resources locked away. This creates a moral contrast, but also a strategic imbalance. From a Machiavellian perspective, Greenland's restraint preserves purity, but sacrifices leverage. From a cold market perspective, it allows others to monetize global demand while Greenland remains a spectator. This is why Greenland repeatedly appears in strategic discussions, political speculation, and long-term resource planning. Not because it dominates today, but because it could disrupt tomorrow. In a world searching for supply diversification, Greenland represents one of the few large untapped reserve pools in politically stable territory. But stability cuts both ways. Political stability also means political resistance to extraction. Environmental protection also means regulatory delay. Local opposition also means social cost. Every ton of rare earths mined in Greenland would carry political weight far beyond its market price. This is the paradox. Greenland is valuable precisely because it is untouched, but it is untouched precisely because it is valuable in a different way. As a symbol of environmental limits, as a bargaining position, as a long-term strategic card. Meanwhile, the production world moves on. China continues to flood the market. The United States tries to reshore. Australia remains a secondary supplier. Smaller producers fill marginal gaps. And Greenland remains a reserve number on a chart. This creates a psychological illusion for viewers. People see Greenland ranked 8th and assume relevance. But relevance in rare earths is not about ranking. It is about throughput. It is about how many tons move from ground to factory, to weapon system, to battery, to server farm. At zero production, Greenland's influence on current supply is mathematically zero, but its influence on future negotiations, future diversification strategies, and future geopolitical narratives is much larger than zero. That is why Greenland is often talked about more than it is mined. It exists more in headlines than in shipping manifests. It exists more in strategic imagination than in real industrial output. And that gap between imagination and output is where long-term power struggles quietly form. Because in the next phase of technological competition, supply security becomes national security. Electric vehicles, AI hardware, advanced defense systems, and renewable infrastructure all depend on stable access to rare earth elements. When one country controls most of that flow, others become structurally dependent. Greenland sits outside that dependency network, not as a supplier, but as a potential alternative. That makes it strategically sensitive, even while it remains economically silent. This is why Greenland is not just a mining story. It is a leverage story. It is about who controls future options. It is about who can activate dormant resources if pressure rises. It is about who holds geological insurance against supply shocks. In that sense, Greenland is not competing with China today. It is positioned against China tomorrow. Not in production volume, but in narrative power, in bargaining leverage, in long-term strategic signaling. For now, the world runs on China's rare earth output. The factories depend on it. The defense systems depend on it. The green energy transition depends on it. Greenland does not change that reality today, but Greenland sits quietly as a reminder that reserves are sleeping power, a reminder that the map of tomorrow does not always match the flows of today, a reminder that strategic value is often invisible until the moment it is activated. And when that moment comes, Greenland will no longer be a footnote on a chart. It will become a decision point in global power alignment. To understand why Greenland matters without producing a single ton, you have to understand how modern power actually works. Power today is not only measured by what you extract, it is measured by what you can threaten to extract. Optionality is leverage. The mere possibility of future supply can reshape negotiations long before the first mine is built. In rare earth markets, the fear is not shortage in theory. The fear is disruption in practice. When one country controls the majority of production flow, any geopolitical tension immediately becomes a supply chain weapon. History has already shown that export restrictions, informal quotas, and regulatory slowdowns can move prices and panic markets. This is why diversification has become a strategic obsession. Governments do not just want more rare earths. They want more politically aligned rare earths. They want supply that cannot be switched off with a policy memo. They want minerals that are not hostage to diplomatic pressure. From that perspective, Greenland is not evaluated as a mining project. It is evaluated as a geopolitical option. It sits in a Western-aligned political environment. It is geographically stable. It is legally predictable. That makes its 1.5 million metric tons of reserves more than a geological statistic. It makes them a strategic alternative. But alternatives are not free. Every alternative supply chain must pay three costs: environmental cost, political cost, and economic cost. China absorbed those costs decades ago. Other countries delayed. Greenland delayed even longer. This delay created a quiet dependency trap. The longer one supplier dominates production, the harder it becomes for others to justify building competing infrastructure. Capital flows where margins exist. If China floods the market, alternative projects struggle to stay profitable. This is not an accident. It is how market dominance self-reinforces. So Greenland's reserves sit in a paradox. They are valuable, but not valuable enough to outcompete a dominant producer without political support. That means Greenland's rare earth future is not driven by geology. It is driven by policy decisions. At some point, rare earth mining in Greenland would not be an economic decision. It would be a strategic decision, a decision to accept higher costs in exchange for supply security, a decision to treat minerals as infrastructure, not as commodities. This is already how defense planners think. A missile guidance system does not care if its magnets are slightly more expensive. It cares if they are available during a crisis. A military supply chain values reliability more than marginal cost savings. In that context, Greenland's zero production is not neutral. It is a vulnerability for allies and an advantage for competitors. Now look again at the production list. China at 270,000 metric tons, the United States at 45,000, Myanmar at 31,000, Australia at 13,000. Then a long tail of much smaller producers. This is not a balanced ecosystem. It is a hub-and-spoke structure. One dominant hub, many marginal spokes. In systems theory, hub dominance creates systemic fragility. If the hub fails, the entire system experiences stress. That is why redundancy is a strategic goal, not efficiency. Redundancy. Greenland represents redundancy that has not been activated. It is a backup generator that has never been turned on. It is insurance that has never been claimed. It is a reserve not just in minerals, but in strategic flexibility. But insurance only works if it can be activated in time. Building mines is not instant. It takes years. Permits, infrastructure, processing facilities, workforce training, environmental assessments. That means Greenland's reserves cannot solve a sudden crisis. They can only shape long-term planning. This creates a subtle psychological effect. Policymakers talk about Greenland as if it is a solution. Markets treat it as if it is irrelevant. Both are partially correct. It is a solution in theory. It is irrelevant in current flow. This tension is what makes Greenland a recurring character in strategic narratives. It is always mentioned, rarely activated, always future tense, never present tense. The countries that dominate production live in the present tense. They shape today's prices. They shape today's supply chains. They shape today's dependencies. Greenland lives in the future tense. It shapes scenarios, not shipments. This difference matters, because global power is increasingly about controlling the present while shaping the future. China controls the present rare earth flow. Greenland represents one of the tools that could shape a different future flow. But shaping a future requires political courage. It requires accepting higher costs. It requires tolerating environmental controversy. It requires prioritizing strategic resilience over short-term efficiency. This is why rare earth policy is no longer just about mining. It is about ideology, about how societies value environment versus security, about how governments weigh local opposition against national strategy, about how democracies and centralized systems make different trade-offs. Greenland's zero production is not a technical failure. It is a political choice. A choice to prioritize environmental and social constraints over industrial activation. That choice has moral weight. It also has strategic consequences. Every year, Greenland does not produce rare earths. China's dominance becomes more normalized. Supply chains become more locked in. Infrastructure investments elsewhere become less attractive. The inertia grows. In strategic competition, inertia is power. Once systems are built, they resist change. That means Greenland's window to become a meaningful alternative is not infinite. It narrows as the dominant supplier deepens its integration. This is why the conversation around Greenland is never really about Greenland alone. It is about whether the West is willing to pay a premium for independence. whether it is willing to treat mineral supply as a national security asset, whether it is willing to accept imperfect environmental outcomes to reduce geopolitical exposure. These are not technical debates. They are philosophical debates disguised as mining policy. On one side is the logic of efficiency. Let the lowest-cost producer dominate. Let the market decide. Accept dependency as the price of cheap inputs. On the other side is the logic of resilience. Accept higher costs. Build redundancy. Treat supply chains as strategic terrain. Greenland sits at the intersection of these two logics. It is where ideology meets geology. For now, the chart is clear. Greenland holds 1.5 million metric tons of reserves. Greenland produces 0. That gap is not just a statistic, it is a choice, a suspended decision. And suspended decisions accumulate pressure. As technology demand rises, as electric vehicles scale, as defense systems modernize, as AI hardware expands, the pressure to activate dormant supply grows. At some point, Greenland's rare earths may stop being an abstract future option and become a concrete political debate. Not about whether they exist, but about whether they should be used. That moment will not be driven by geology. It will be driven by fear. Fear of disruption. Fear of dependency. Fear of strategic vulnerability. In that sense, Greenland's true resource is not rare earths. It is optionality under pressure. The ability to change the balance if the world becomes less stable. Until then, Greenland remains a quiet line on a chart. 8th in reserves. 0 in production. Powerful in theory. Silent in practice. And that silence is not accidental. It is the sound of a decision being postponed. The future of rare earths will not be decided by maps. It will be decided by stress. Systems only reveal their true structure under pressure. When supply chains are calm, dependency is invisible. When tension rises, dependency becomes leverage. Greenland exists for that moment, not as a supplier, as a signal that alternative supply is possible even if it is not yet real. In strategic language, signaling shapes behavior long before action does. The knowledge that dormant reserves exist in a politically aligned territory changes how dominant suppliers calculate risk. This is why Greenland's role is psychological as much as geological. It introduces uncertainty into a system built on predictability. It tells dominant producers that monopoly is not destiny. That dominance can be challenged if political will appears. But psychology cuts both ways. As long as Greenland remains inactive, dominant producers can discount it. They can treat it as hypothetical. They can assume that environmental resistance and political friction will keep it offline indefinitely. This creates a dangerous equilibrium. Both sides wait. One side dominates. The other side preserves potential. The longer this balance holds, the more entrenched the present structure becomes. In this equilibrium, Greenland is not neutral. It is a silent variable, a conditional future, a threat that is never spoken aloud but always understood. For markets, this uncertainty is irrelevant. Markets price what exists, not what might exist. That is why China's production volume translates directly into influence. That is why Greenland's reserves translate into speculation, not pricing power. But for strategists, potential is currency. They think in scenarios, not in spot prices. They ask what happens if trade routes are disrupted, what happens if sanctions expand, what happens if technology restrictions escalate. In those scenarios, dormant supply becomes priceless. Not because it is cheap, because it is independent. This is where Greenland's story becomes darker. Because independence has a cost. It requires compromise, It requires accepting that strategic security often conflicts with environmental purity. Every ton of rare earths mined in Greenland would be politically louder than the same ton mined elsewhere. It would carry symbolic weight. It would become a test case, a referendum on whether Western systems are willing to industrialize when strategic pressure rises. That is why Greenland's mining debate is not local. It is ideological. It is about what kind of power system the future will run on. One optimized for efficiency, or one optimized for resilience. The chart does not show ideology. It shows outcomes. China at 270,000 metric tons of production. The rest of the world fragmented. Greenland at 0. 0 is not just a number. 0 is a statement. It says this resource is not yet part of the power game. It says this lever has not been pulled. But levers are not built to remain untouched forever. They are built for moments of necessity. As global competition intensifies, the definition of necessity shifts. What was once optional becomes urgent. What was once uneconomic becomes strategic. What was once politically difficult becomes politically unavoidable. Greenland may not choose this moment. The moment may choose Greenland. When that happens, the narrative will flip. Greenland will no longer be discussed as a reserve holder. It will be discussed as a supply node, a processing site, a political flashpoint, a strategic asset in motion. That transformation will not be quiet. It will attract global attention. It will provoke environmental backlash. It will trigger geopolitical signaling. It will test alliances. And when that transformation begins, it will not be about how much Greenland produces at first. It will be about what Greenland represents. A break in monopoly psychology. A breach in assumed dominance. In power systems, perception often moves faster than reality. The announcement of a mine can matter more than its output. The decision to permit extraction can matter more than the first shipment. This is why dormant reserves are dangerous to monopolies. They are not dangerous today. They are dangerous to tomorrow's certainty. Greenland is not a challenger today. It is a question mark. And question marks are uncomfortable for dominant systems. They introduce strategic noise. They force contingency planning. They weaken the psychological grip of inevitability. In that sense, Greenland's most valuable export right now is uncertainty. Uncertainty forces hedging. It forces diversification planning. It forces political attention. It forces long-term investment conversations. Even at zero production, Greenland already shapes strategy rooms, not markets, strategy rooms. That is where real power is planned. So when you look at this chart, do not just see numbers. See time horizons. See present dominance and future options. See active power and dormant power. China's 270,000 metric tons represent present control. Greenland's 1.5 million metric tons represent future potential. The difference between control and potential is political will. And political will is not triggered by comfort. It is triggered by fear. Fear of shortage. Fear of coercion. Fear of vulnerability. When that fear becomes real enough, dormant resources stop being theoretical. They become tools. At that moment, Greenland will not be judged by its environmental restraint. It will be judged by its strategic relevance. Until then, it remains in a liminal state. Too large to ignore, too constrained to activate, too important to forget. That is a dangerous place to exist in geopolitics, because it means others will plan around you before you plan for yourself. Greenland is already part of global power calculations, even without producing a single ton, even without shipping a single crate, even without refining a single gram. That is the paradox of modern resource power. The future is decided before the mine is built. And that brings us to the deeper truth of this chart. This is not a story about minerals. This is a story about who controls options. In the modern world, power is no longer measured only by territory, population, or even money. It is measured by control over bottlenecks, the narrow points where entire systems must pass. Rare earths are one of those bottlenecks. They are invisible to consumers, but indispensable to civilization. When a single country dominates that bottleneck, the balance of power quietly shifts. Not through conquest, through dependency, through normalization, through the slow acceptance that there is no alternative. This is why the rare earth story is not about who has the most in the ground. It is about who controls the flow. China's 270,000 metric tons of annual production is not just output. It is leverage. It is the ability to shape timelines, pricing, and geopolitical confidence. Greenland's 1.5 million metric tons of reserves represent something very different. They represent optionality without activation, power without movement, influence without execution. In strategic terms, Greenland is a loaded asset that has not been deployed. This creates a dangerous illusion, the illusion that future alternatives will automatically appear when needed. But alternatives are not built in emergencies. They are built years in advance. They require political consensus before fear becomes dominant. If Greenland waits until a crisis, it will be too late to matter in that crisis. Mines cannot be conjured on demand. Infrastructure does not appear overnight. Strategic resilience must be built before it is needed. That is the lesson hidden inside this chart. It is not enough to have resources. You must have readiness. This is where long-term power systems diverge. Some systems prioritize efficiency. Others prioritize resilience. Efficiency minimizes cost in calm periods. Resilience minimizes damage in turbulent periods. Rare earths sit at the center of that trade-off. China optimized for scale and tolerance. It accepted environmental and political costs to build dominance. Other systems optimized for restraint and regulation. They accepted dependency in exchange for internal stability. Greenland reflects that second choice. It reflects a system that values environmental and social constraints. That choice is morally coherent. It is also strategically consequential. This does not mean Greenland is wrong. It means Greenland is different. It plays a different game, a game where potential is preserved instead of monetized. But preserved potential is not the same as power. Preserved potential is deferred power. Deferred power is only real if it is eventually activated. Otherwise, it becomes symbolic. Symbols inspire. Power compels. In the coming decades, the demand for rare earths will not decline. Electrification, renewable energy, advanced computing, and defense modernization all intensify demand. That means the bottleneck will tighten, not loosen. As that bottleneck tightens, dormant reserves become more tempting. Political resistance weakens under strategic pressure. Environmental arguments collide with security arguments. Local concerns collide with global dependencies. This is where Greenland's future becomes uncertain. Not uncertain geologically, uncertain politically. At some point, the question will no longer be whether Greenland has rare earths. The question will be whether Greenland is willing to turn them into leverage. That decision will not be made in a vacuum. It will be made in a world shaped by supply disruptions, strategic rivalry, and technological competition. When that moment comes, Greenland's quiet position will end. It will no longer be a line on a chart. It will become a node in a power network. Until then, Greenland exists in a strategic shadow. Known, watched, considered, but not activated. And that may be the most dangerous state of all. Because when a resource is valuable but unused, Others begin to plan around it. They factor it into their long-term strategies. They prepare for its activation or for its permanent absence. In that sense, Greenland is already shaping the future without moving a single ton of ore. Not through production, through possibility. That is the final truth of this chart. Power today belongs to those who control the flow. Power tomorrow will belong to those who control the options. Greenland controls options. China controls flow. And the future of global power will be decided by which matters more when pressure rises. That is why Greenland's rare earths are not a mining story. They are a patience story. They are a leverage story. They are a story about how long a system can afford to wait before potential becomes necessity. And in a world that is moving faster, more fragmented, and more competitive, waiting itself becomes a strategic risk. Because eventually, every dormant lever is pulled. The only question is who decides when.